Leadham.
For the record, Tim Leadham appearing as counsel for the Conservation Coalition. In all probability, Mr. Commissioner, this is probably the last time I'll be able to address you through a panel, and I wanted to take the opportunity to thank specifically Mr. Giles, Mr. Lunn, and Ms. Keeley. They've been very helpful to me throughout the course of these hearings, and I wanted to acknowledge publicly on the record their assistance throughout.
Thank you, Mr. Leadham.
Welcome back, panel. I think that I recognize most of you from other appearances, and I thank you for coming back at the tail end of our examination of this topic. And I want to ask many questions about the wild salmon policy specifically, so most of my focus will be directed at that policy and its implementation and some of the other issues around it. But I also want to begin by trying to understand if I can get this panel's evidence with respect to two critical questions. And I think they're mainly scientific questions. We've heard a lot of science, as you probably know. We've heard a lot of panels come and go with esteemed scientists who have come and given their opinion about what has caused or what could have caused the decline of the Fraser River sockeye over the last decade, and what specifically could have caused or led to the decline in 2009. And it's a bit perplexing because in 2010, as you acknowledged, Deputy, they came back in record numbers. So I wanted to make sure before I embark upon my questions that I have this panel's evidence with respect to, in your opinion, or does this panel have an opinion about what caused the general decline? We've heard evidence, for example, that there are many multivariate factors that led to the decline. I wondered if this panel shares that view, that somehow the factors may have been contributing either in a synergistic fashion or in some compensatory fashion to have brought about the decline. So do I have your evidence that you're of that view as well, that there's no one single cause for the decline?
I can respond. As a manager, I was not in the business of forming opinions about what things were going on. I was receiving information from science, recommendations from science, and I would do the same in this regard. I would not presume to have a formed opinion about what may have done it. Clearly, we deal with complex systems, and there's probably no one answer, but that's something that I would turn to our scientific colleagues to receive that information.
Well, that leaves me with you, Dr. Richards. Are you of the view that there's no one single factor that overall has contributed to the decline of the Fraser River sockeye? And specifically with reference to the 2009 decline, we can't really point our fingers at one specific cause, can we?
I think our best evidence was done, Mr. Commissioner, in a briefing note that I authored following on a workshop that we held in April of 2011. And certainly we have not been able to identify one single cause. If we're looking at likelihood, we think that it's most likely that there was something early in the marine history, in the time spent in the marine area for juvenile sockeye, in the Strait of Georgia, or perhaps extending a bit further north.
In Queen Charlotte Sound.
Into Queen Charlotte Sound, but yes, we have not been able to identify any individual specific factor.
And I take it that the managers on the panel accept that advice. Is that correct? I see head nodding.
Yes. And maybe if I could just be a little clear, I think we would agree and concur, I think, with some of the work that was done and presented by Mr. Marmarak, and say that, yes, we think it's likely that it was not, just because we can't find one single event, suggests to us that it wasn't necessarily one single event, but probably a sequence of things which contributed.
Right. So what that tells me, as a layperson here examining the managers and the scientists, is that we're basically in a position of not knowing. We're basically making some educated guesses and drawing some alternative hypotheses, but we basically do not know. Is that fair to say?
I think we have some evidence on some things. I mean, science is always it's very, very difficult to prove something in science. You can have, you try to go to the extent you can with certainty, but it's very difficult to actually get proof in this context. What we're looking for was some event that happened in 2009 or earlier, and for which, you know, we don't, in going back in retrospect, necessarily have all the right data that we might wish we had had to try to answer some of those questions. So I think we've got a lot of evidence about some things, and so we certainly have done a lot of work and made some progress, but this is not an area where you're going to have certainty.
Right. And so we still have some distance to go before we can definitively say, and we may never be able to say.
I think, if I may, that based on our best evidence now is we certainly have been able to, well, we've tried to give you and lay out the evidence that we had, but there's always a situation where, gee, I wish I'd had that particular sample at that time that might have helped.
All right. And to a large extent, I think your evidence, Dr. Richards, mirrors what I've heard from a lot of other scientists who have preceded you to that particular place, and in which they say, we wish we knew, but we don't know. That's fair, is it not? I
think we always would wish that we could provide more certainty, and that we always wish that we'd had more information on certain points, but I think we have done a tremendous amount of work to try to pull the evidence together and to try to present as much information as we have in front of this commission.
Now, a lot of the scientists who came and presented evidence to this commission called for research proposals. They called for further research into discrete areas. More often than not, it happened to coincide with the area that they themselves were researching, but I don't necessarily see that as a disparaging thing on their parts. What are we going to do or make of all of those calls for research proposals? Does DFO have a reaction to all of that?
I did mention earlier that one of the things we have been doing in the interim since the June workshop is an inventory of the work that's going on out there about the priority or most probable areas that were identified not only in that workshop but in the interim. So reviewing, and there may be some modification of that based on this inventory. And we're doing that under the auspices of the Pacific Salmon Commission. And we are planning to, at this executive meeting, discuss and formulate next steps in terms of exactly the kind of things that were being talked about at that forum, which is what are the priorities for research and what are the areas where there is data and information, you know, it's kind of the probable thing, where can you make the most headway and what are the most probable causes. So DFO is very much engaged in moving that forward.
And Ms. Farlinger, if I can just stay with you for a moment, would you also envelop within that moving forward in a workshop type procedure the academic community who also shares some interest in these bigger questions, and also the consultants who have come and gone, and also traditional Aboriginal knowledge into that kind of an approach? Would you agree with me on that?
We were hoping very much to use a similar format to the workshop in 2010, but I have to say we haven't yet come to that conclusion. We do know that we need to include expertise outside the department, and to the extent we can use traditional ecological knowledge, we would certainly be looking for ways to include that.
Deputy, you have a comment?
If I just may add to that, certainly I would expect that when the results of that workshop make their way through the system in any form of advice, I would be looking to make sure that the groups that you've just defined have been involved in some way.
Right. And Mr. Bevan, you have your hand raised.
Yes, and while there's going to be work done to try and fill knowledge gaps, I think it's really important for managers to understand that we're dealing with extraordinarily complex systems here that we don't fully understand, and I don't think we will fully understand them for some time. Therefore, management decisions are going to have to be made in the face of a high level of uncertainty,
Yes.
and in the knowledge of that, we can help to avoid risks. indeed, in my opinion, that if we were to think we had it made, we knew exactly what was going on and act on a level of certainty, that in our past has led us to a rather unhappy outcome, because we thought we had it right, we didn't, and we made mistakes that were very significant and have led to the implementation of the precautionary approach in this country and in fish management around the world, as they've all witnessed what happened to northern cod, etc., as a classic example where we thought we had a system that was very accurate, acted on it, and only to find out it was wrong, and we brought hopefully reversible, but it's been a long time, but very significant damage to the ecosystem. So we're going to live with uncertainty for a period of time and have to be prepared to face that as our reality.
Right, and I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Bevan, because I want to come back to you with respect to a discussion of the precautionary approach in the context of the wild salmon policy. Before I do that, I want to talk to you about the wild salmon policy and engender some discussion, because certainly from the perspective of my clients, they see that as a way of moving forward. You probably are well aware that at the time that the wild salmon policy was passed, that there was a significant buy-in gradually from all significant stakeholders into that policy. And my clients certainly see it as a way of moving forward in terms of how the fishery is managed and how habitat is protected and how the ecosystem is going to be actually acknowledged in the context of Fraser River sockeye. And I know, Deputy, the last time you came here, I think you talked about the ecosystem approach and how it was in your DNA, that essentially that you recognize that it's important to look at things globally and not just isolate Fraser River sockeye as a single species. You're nodding your head yes.
I am, and I think I've repeated those comments here in the past few days. It's
Yes.
impossible for us to even pretend to manage without that consideration.
No, I accept the evidence I heard earlier from you last week that when the wild salmon policy was being brought in, perhaps there was a certain aura of naivete about how long it would actually take before the policy could be rolled out as an implemented policy. And so obviously there had to be some fundamental work, some research done, and we're still doing that. Are we not, Dr. Richards, and with respect to Dr. Grant's work that we've seen?
I think these, when we start to look at some of these questions, like others, we uncover other questions that we need to look at, and really this is going to continue as a work in progress. There will always be something new that we could do on the subject, and in fact the science and the scientific thinking in these areas continues to evolve as we get more knowledge worldwide on how to approach these kinds of problems.
But from a management perspective, Mr. Bevan, wouldn't you agree with me that as the science starts to inform the management, that those kinds of information, the scientific information, particularly with respect to the designation of conservation units, the benchmarks and so forth, they should be incorporated into management decision making, right?
Yes, that's the basic element of the precautionary approach. We need to identify the stock. That's the conservation unit in the case of Fraser River sockeye. We need to identify where the limit references are, where that population can bounce back from, and have some assurance that we aren't taking it to a position where it's going to be a long time or it will be impossible to recover it. But those are very, very complex scientific questions. So we, in the wild salmon policy, put to science those questions, and I think we're discovering just how difficult it is for science to answer. And that's not just in Fraser River sockeye. That's being a real question, like how low can a population be before there's a long recovery problem, and that's been very difficult to come to those conclusions. We're getting there, and we are incorporating them in our fish management plans.
Now, you're also, sorry, Deputy, you
if I
had your
may
hand
on
raised.
that, yes. It's back to the question of is it implemented or not, and
Yes.
I would say that the approach within the wild salmon policy has been implemented and will continue to be implemented. We were not as we were not able to gather the information and answer all the tough questions as quickly as we thought we could be. But as those questions are being addressed or information found, it is being incorporated. And the approach to managing the fishery as defined in the wild salmon policy is, to the best of our knowledge at this point, being implemented. And we will continue to look for other information.
And that will be done, Deputy, at the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, would it not? Maybe the regional director has some information on that.
Well, I think the annual expression of what that long-term decision is around where those management decisions will be made is in the individual or in the integrated fishery management plan. But I think, as several people have said, it will be incremental as new information comes. There will be those kinds of decisions that will require broad sort of public policy kind of input, as opposed to just the people who are harvesting the fish. And so there are a number of challenges envisioned, I think, in Strategy 4 that are going to be longer term rather than shorter term. But I think as we've talked about over the last 5 years, there are specific elements where we have the information in the Integrated Fishery Management Plan, and when we have it, we pull it in and we use it to inform the decisions.
Right. And so once you have certain information about the conservation units, and I like to concretize this by referring to a discrete example of Cultus Lake sockeye, which we all know about, we've heard a lot of evidence about. And so once we know that we have a conservation unit such as the Cultus Lake sockeye, which has a specific genetic diversity from other conservation units, you acknowledge that, do you not? Dr. Richards?
Well, we have identified Cultus as a separate conservation unit.
Right. Okay, so once we know that, right, I think then it becomes a decision of management. How will you protect that genetic diversity for the Cultus Lake in the context of what we're calling a mixed stock fishery? And that's the problem, you see, and that's the problem that I tried to raise with scientists and eminent scientists, and it's a problem I'm going to come back to with you. How do you deal with preserving genetic diversity of specific conservation units if you're fishing non-selectively, if you're fishing in a mixed stock fishery? Do you have any solutions to that?
We did talk earlier, and as I said, there's some detailed discussion of this in the Skeena Science panel report, and I wish there were an easy answer, but the issue of selectivity and how you do it is highly variable depending on the fishery and the circumstances. But to move beyond that, I think, is really looking at how can we manage this fishery differently so that fishing selectively is what happens.
Right. And are you looking at that?
Well, I think you've heard some evidence that talks about DFO's work across a wide spectrum, taking a look at, for example, how a share-based fishery might do that. That doesn't mean a share-based fishery is the only way to do it.
Right.
It just means it's a way to do that, and one of the reasons the two reasons that as regulators we're looking at that. One is to meet the conservation requirements, first and foremost, and then the secondly is to provide fishermen the flexibility to be able to make a living out of the fishing they do. But I'm not suggesting share-based management is the light in the way. It's simply a way to explore other ways of fishing. The selective fishing policy and the demonstration fisheries we've been doing, whether they're about share-based or whether they're about fishing in a different area or whether they're about fishing with a different gear, are all setting us in that direction of how better to manage the fishery to meet the conservation and the economic prosperity requirements, which are both, and the cultural and other requirements that are there.
Right. And one other way might be to move the fishery further along the Fraser, because we are specifically talking about Fraser River sockeye here. So would you not also, in your toolkit, as you called it, also consider moving the fishery further inland and looking at terminal fisheries and how you can protect genetic diversity in the context of having more terminal fisheries.
That's certainly the direction of the fisheries management that's occurred over the last 20 to 25 years in management of British Columbia and Yukon salmon fisheries. And also, as you know very well, it's one of the aspects of demonstration fisheries we're looking at. It's probably, well, it certainly isn't the only solution. It's certainly one of the solutions that we are looking at.
I want to then pull the discussion back into precautionary approach and make sure I understand your evidence before I embark upon a discussion with you, Mr. Bevan. Did I hear you correctly when you said that in the context of a multi-stock fishery, such as we have with Fraser River sockeye, that a precautionary approach is embodied within the wild salmon policy?
That's because of the biology of the salmon. You can't just transport or use the current model for the precautionary approach in the context of a species where you'll fish on one year class just as it's spawning and then it all dies. So the wild salmon policy was the method of applying the precautionary approach to that kind of a population.
Okay. And I want to begin by pulling up an email exchange that I have listed, and hopefully you had an opportunity to visit this before I came to the podium. Could we have conservation document number 8, please? It's an email exchange. A number of high-ranking officials, Paul Ryle, I see, is listed there. And just to set the context as I understood it for this email exchange, the discussion is the precautionary approach document that has been tendered into evidence. And I found some words from Mr. Rob Crunland to be rather informative. I don't know who he is in the context of DFO. You probably are better poised to answer that than I am.
Rob Crunland is a biologist working on the groundfish group at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo for Fisheries and Oceans Canada.
Okay, so admittedly it's coming from a groundfish perspective, but what I found, if we go to PDF 2, the second page, and I'm going to read this, Mr. Bevan, because I think it will set the context and will allow you to follow along as well. The question 1 relates to multi-stock fishing. How can you have a precautionary approach in a multi-stock fishery? And he says part of the answer relates to being clear about the fishery objectives. The PA, meaning precautionary approach, applies equally well whether there is one stock or many. The difficulty is that we have some capacity building to do within DFO and with stakeholders to learn how to define measurable fishery objectives for a multi-species or multi-stock situation. The lessons from salmon indicate that the total yield from a mix of stocks is less than the sum of the individual single stock yields. And development of the wild salmon policy indicates how difficult it is to grapple with stating the objectives. And then he talks about the groundfish fishery there. And then he says, furthermore, being clear about what is desired in terms of measurable objectives across the species in a multi-species fishery is as close as we are likely to come to making ecosystem management operational. For example, focusing on maximizing harvest from the more productive stocks will inevitably result in overharvest of weaker stocks. The goal is to make those trade-offs explicit in order to inform decision makers. I'm just going to stop there because I think this is pretty sage advice in terms of how you move forward. If you have genetic diversity that you're trying to protect through the wild salmon policy, you basically have a situation where you're going to be in danger of overharvesting certain conservation units because they're weaker and you need to rebuild back. Do I have that right, that concept right?
Yes, you do. If in the past we had harvest rates 60 to 80%, you can't do that in the current context. The weak stocks just couldn't take that kind of pressure and you have to drop the overall harvest rate. So when you're saying that the overall rate of exploitation will be less than you could have if you were able to fish specifically on each individual population component. That's correct. You can't fish as hard as you otherwise could on the aggregate, because you have to protect the weak stocks. And
Yes.
this also comes from the groundfish, where we have the integrated groundfish process, and we set specific limits on every population that they were exploiting, and every mortality had to be accounted for, and within the limits that were set.
And certainly we saw that for the 2009 return, when there was basically no fishing.
That's correct, and that's not just 2009. We've in salmon, happily, is one pattern that hasn't been found in a lot of other fisheries, and that is that the fishery has gone down substantially, but more substantially than the escapements. We reduce the fishery in order to provide the appropriate level of escapement, or the best level that we could under the circumstances. And if that meant no fishery, that's what happened, and therefore the drop in the fishery is actually greater than the drop in the escapements.
And later on in that same paragraph, Mr. Crowland says, the job of science guys is to make those trade-offs clear and describe the risk in the face of uncertainty, which will never go away. And he says, as Sinclair points out below, this is, I gather, another scientist. Is that right, Dr. Richards?
Yes, Alan Sinclair is a scientist who's now retired, but I can't remember exactly what year he retired, but I assume at this time that he was still working as a scientist within the same groundfish group.
So there's a host of international agreements that provide guidance on the conservation axis, and fishery managers and stakeholders need to weigh in on the yield and volatility axes as described by the framework. So coming back then to the wild salmon policy, if we apply the wild salmon policy in a precautionary way, as you suggest it ought to be applied, Mr. Bevan, then obviously we have to protect the weak stock and protect against overharvesting. Do I have that right?
And I think that you can see from the behavior of the department that is indeed what has been happening in recent years.
Could we have this email exchange marked as the next exhibit, please?
1938.
Now, the wild salmon policy not only talks about conservation as the core, central, and foremost principle, but also talks about getting to a state where we can have sustainable fisheries. I mean, I think all of us in this room want to be able to see that our fisheries are sustainable. And to that extent, I think that what you're endeavoring to do is build up the stock so that they can be sustainable. Do I have that right from a management perspective?
I think that's always our objective, is to have that, but the real challenge, and I'll turn to Sue Farlinger for a more detailed answer, is that when we're dealing with mixed stocks, mixed species, or at least populations of different productivity, it's very difficult to get to the point where you have a constant level of harvest. That's not realistic. We're dealing with too variable a system and too much difference between 1 year and the next, or even one year on a particular cycle and the next cycle. It's just too variable to actually have a constant. We need to find a way to allow the industry to adjust to that reality, to function within that reality, and to be able to adapt as required based on whatever Mother Nature is putting to us. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, I was just thinking about this whole issue of protect weak stocks, and in the face of somehow creating access to those more productive stocks, and my mind went back again to the analysis that was done on the Skeena, where we have precisely the same problem. We have various more productive stocks for a variety of different reasons than on the Fraser, and we have wild stocks, and there is a discussion in there with, you know, innumerable graphs and discussions of the scientific uncertainty about whether you're actually really just preventing a stock from being harvested at its maximum yield, or whether you're just preventing a stock from rebuilding, or in fact whether you are driving it down to extinction. So there remain a huge number of questions about whatever management decisions go in place. the whole matter of simply protecting weak stocks is so complex. And when I look at that analysis, I see that there's a variety of opinions and possibilities within those things I just talked about. So it gets back to the issue that even if you accept the uncertainty, there still is, it's very hard to find an understandable, simple answer that we can have confidence in.
And hence this commission. I mean, basically, I don't accept for a moment that all of you are satisfied with the status quo, and that you're looking to this commission to provide some advice to you in terms of how to move forward with respect to all of these very difficult issues and competing interests, are you not? I want to get a couple of exhibits marked, if I could, and if I could have tab 11 of the Conservation Coalition's documents. This is a communications plan for sustainable fisheries framework. Have you seen this before, Mr. Bevan, or anyone on the panel?
Yes, I have.
Could we have this marked as the next exhibit, please? And could I have tab 31 of Conservation Coalition's documents, please? This is a document entitled Harvest Strategy Compliant with the Precautionary Approach. Mr. Bevan, have you seen this as well?
Yes, I have.
Could we have that marked as the next exhibit, please?
1940.
So I want to come back to a hard question again, which is realizing that the wild salmon policy is a difficult policy in terms of what it means or how it's to be implemented. What will be going forward in time in terms of what we can look for from DFO in terms of the actual implementation of that policy? I don't want to necessarily pin you down to dates, but I do want to get some sense that there's some commitment from DFO in terms of how we're moving forward and how you conceive of us moving forward on that.
We can't be pinned down on dates, obviously, because as we've said many times, science begets more science, and so we will continue to implement it. We will continue to work with our stakeholders to make sure that it's the correct approach to go. But we are really, as you said earlier, looking forward to the findings of this commission, because there's been a significant amount of time and attention paid to the wild salmon policy, and we will obviously read with interest and study with interest any recommendations that would come in relation to the wild salmon policy. So whether or not there would be changes, we will have to wait and see, and whether or not there are new timelines attached, we will have to wait and see.
Yes, thank you for that, Deputy. I want to pick up a little bit further. When we discuss the wild salmon policy, we hear from Mr. Pat Shamoot, and you may recall and you may know from experience, either personal or through hearsay, that the negotiations and discussions around bringing that wild salmon policy actually to a state where we can call it a policy, it was bogged down. And Mr. Shamoot took over and he basically championed it and moved it forward in a way that perhaps no other senior civil servant could at that time. And I'm wondering if we're in that same sort of lock status right now, where if we actually appointed someone as czar of the wild salmon policy, that we could actually move this forward. Does that sound reasonable to you, Deputy?
I think David has a desire to say something as well, but we've heard the notion of a champion a few times in the past week, and as I've said, Sue is in fact the guardian of this policy, if not the champion, as are others though, and we are moving in the department towards, or at least we are continuing the road towards integration in all that we do, and rather than creating more silos and having people defend their turf, we're trying very hard to be very integrated in what we do, and so the wild salmon policy needs to be integrated into the broader suite of policies to make sure that it is moving along with everything else. So for me, the verdict is not quite in yet as to whether or not a champion is what's required at this point. It may have been required at the time because some of the thinking in the policy was quite new at the time, or at least my understanding is it was really a matter of corralling what was the common practice and putting it in a codified form, if I can say that. So maybe a champion was required to concretize it at that point, but there's no dispute, really. Well, there might be some dispute. We may hear some dispute in terms of application, but generally now it's a matter of moving forward on it, and that's a different world than where we were before. But I think David was there, so he may have a different answer.
But, and I thank you for that, Deputy, but my clients want some, they want some reassurance, I think, that the wild salmon policy is not just sitting off to the side of somebody's desk, and particularly with respect to the science that's necessary to inform the decision makers under the wild salmon policy, that somehow we don't get bogged down in the science in defining limit reference points and conservation units. And I'm wondering if there's a role for somebody to really make sure that things are actually being done.
We'll turn it over to Sue, because there's somebody there who's actually accountable for getting the things done in the region. But
You're holding your head, Ms. Furniture.
Wouldn't you?
But I think, though, looking at where we are right now, you've got a document up on the screen talking about harvest strategy complying with a precautionary approach. We're moving to implement the precautionary approach in the fish management plans of all our major fisheries. So we've got them in a number. One of the more interesting ones was Gulf crab. That precautionary approach helped the minister take very tough decisions, because it involves defining the limit reference points and how to keep the fishery out of the critical zone, and also defined decision rules up front. That application of the precautionary approach, as I noted, is not simple to deal with in terms of Pacific salmon, because you're not dealing with a fishery that's clean. It's a mixed stock. You're not dealing with a standing biomass of multi-year spawners. You're dealing with a different circumstance, and that's why there was the salmon policy was more complex. Hatchimute got it through to get it approved. But now what we have to do, and are doing, I would argue, is using that concept of looking at the populations in a more complex way, not managing the stock aggregates, but rather considering things like Cultus Lake, and considering things like coho, Thompson River coho, that drive some decisions on limiting fishing opportunities on other species. So it's not just sockeye we have to look at, it's the whole ecosystem. And we have moved down that path. We aren't going to say, look, we're not going to implement it until we have every CU identified with or limit reference points, etc. We're moving now, and we are considering harvest strategies in light of weak stock. We go to the minister and we say, we need the following decisions from you relevant to Fraser River sockeye. It has to involve Cultus Lake harvest rates and other weak stocks that are of concern, and then once the ministers accepted that, we manage to it. Sue, I don't know if you want to add more about what's going on in the Pacific region?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. If we were just managing the fish, life would be easy, but of course we're not. We're managing all kinds of human activity, and that's why there is a Department of Fisheries, and you know, everybody knows that. So there is a science component, and there is uncertainty, which we've all talked about. However, that uncertainty plays into the decisions that have social and economic impacts too. And that means when we speak with those who are concerned about the stocks, those who are affected at various levels, that you know, we have very much to deal with the social issue. And then we have very much to provide the advice to the minister, who has to deal with it through another political and social process. And so I think what David is saying really is the reality, that there is not a decision that we put up about how we manage salmon that does not say, if you consider the wild salmon policy strategy X, Y, or Z, and where we are on that continuum, you know, this is the advice we have, these are the uncertainties we have around it, and these are the social and economic implications of moving forward on that. that really is, I think, the test of implementation is, are we actually doing that and making sure that that is influencing all the decisions that are made? Because at the end of it, we are a regulator and we're regulating human activities, so all our decisions have to be taken in that context. And I would just return to something I said earlier, that the reason we had to write down the wild salmon policy is because we were going in that direction. Because most of us were a science-based organization. We began to understand things we didn't understand 30 and 40, 50 years ago when we were managing these fish. We had international relationships, all of these things pointed us in that direction. I think the real issue is we need to understand there is a social, economic, and political decision-making process that must be informed by the whole premises that are set out in the wild salmon policy. And so in terms of implementing it, that is job one, I think. It's also important to say that if we have choices about what science gets done, and we always have choices and have to set priorities, that's something we keep alive and well. And similarly, with respect to the other aspects, I think the habitat renewal is taking a look at the habitat program, the habitat policy in that same sort of context. Let's think of it in the context for salmon as it pertains to salmon in that context. And so I think you can probably hear me saying that I think that is how we do it. And that is how we'll move the wild salmon policy forward.
And Deputy, I know you had a thought, but we're going to have to come back to you tomorrow, so hold that thought. No, you did not have a thought? Okay. All right, well, I'll come back to some other discussions with you tomorrow then, if I may. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you very much.
Hearing is now adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.